My name is Nadia Mitchell, and this morning, while I was ironing the crease of my crimson gown, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. "We're too busy helping your sister move," it said, followed by a cheerful emoji as if that softened the sting. I stared at it for a moment, feeling that familiar quiet settle over me, the kind that comes from realizing you've been placed second once again, and then I typed back two simple words. "That's okay." No sarcasm. No guilt trip. Just calm. Because what they didn't know was that in less than 2 hours, I would be standing on the stage of Memorial Auditorium receiving the President's Award, the highest honor Stanford gives for service and innovation. When the lights dimmed and my name Nadia Mitchell glowed across the giant LED screen, the entire hall rose in applause. Except for 2 seats in the front row, still empty, ribbons of cardinal red untouched by the spotlight. By the time the ceremony ended, my phone was vibrating nonstop, relatives calling to ask why my parents weren't there, reporters searching for a quote about the missing family. I didn't answer. I just looked at those empty chairs and thought of all the years that had led to this one quiet truth. Have you ever been overlooked by your own family until your success made them realize what they'd lost? Tell me where you're watching from. I grew up in a small town in Oregon where life moved slowly and everyone knew which family sat where in church on Sundays. The Trans were the kind of family people nodded to with polite approval. My father, Thomas, an accountant who wore the same brown shoes for 20 years. My mother, Claire, who led the women's choir. And my little sister, Sophie, who seemed to radiate the kind of light that people couldn't help but turn toward. Everywhere we went, it was always, "Oh, you must be Sophie's sister." That was my introduction, my role, my permanent label. I learned early that being second wasn't a punishment, it was just how the world had arranged itself. Sophie was sunshine, all laughter and ribbons, the kind of girl who was born to be adored. I was the shadow that made her brightness possible, the one who remembered to bring her water bottle to recitals and stayed up late finishing the school projects she forgot about. When I was 10, I realized for the first time how invisible I had become. My birthday fell in early May, right when my parents were busy redecorating Sophie's room. She was 8 then, and Mom decided she was growing up so fast and deserved a space of her own. The living room was filled with boxes from the local moving expo, bright pink banners, and a cake that read, "Congratulations, Sophie," in thick white frosting. I remember standing beside it, smiling for pictures that weren't meant for me, the cheap camera flash washing out my face. When I pointed out that it was also my birthday, Mom paused for half a second before saying, "Oh honey, we can celebrate yours next weekend. Right now, let's not confuse things." So I clapped for Sophie with everyone else and sang along as she blew out candles on a cake that should have been mine. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the confetti was swept away, I found a small gift bag on the kitchen table with my name scribbled wrong, Isabel, on the tag. Inside was a notebook with the logo of Northwest Moving Expo printed across the cover. It was one of those free giveaways my father used to collect at work conferences. The paper inside smelled faintly of cardboard and printer ink. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It wasn't a gift so much as a reminder that even my name didn't quite belong anywhere. Still, I took it to my room, sat by the window, and opened to the first page. The lines were blank, the kind of blank that dares you to fill it. I picked up a pencil and began to write nothing grand, just words about the day, about the pink balloons, about how the candles smelled like sugar and wax and disappointment. That night, without realizing it, I started doing something that would later save me. I began writing my own story. Sophie's room became the house's new centerpiece. Every neighbor who visited got a tour. Can you believe she chose the colors herself? Mom would beam, showing off the lavender curtains and the golden lettering above the bed that said, "Sophie's Space." I watched from the doorway, holding the notebook close to my chest. When Mom saw me, she smiled in that absent, distracted way and said, "Nadia, sweetheart, could you bring Sophie some lemonade?" So I did. That was how most of my childhood felt, like walking in and out of other people's celebrations, carrying trays they forgot they'd asked for. At school, it wasn't much different. Teachers adored Sophie before she even arrived in their classrooms. "Oh, you're Sophie's sister? She's such a delight," they'd say, expecting me to mirror her charm. I never did. I was the quiet one, the girl who read under trees during recess, who fixed the projector when it jammed, who didn't complain when paired for group projects with kids who never did their part. If someone noticed me, it was usually because something needed fixing. If someone praised me, it was because I'd made things easier for someone else. But inside the margins of that moving expo notebook, I found a kind of refuge. Every night before bed, I'd write about things I couldn't say aloud, the way the house fell silent after Sophie's laughter faded down the hall, the way Mom's compliments to her felt like tiny paper cuts to me, the way I wanted, just once, to be the one people noticed first. Writing didn't change anything outside my room, but it made the silence less heavy. I learned that words could be a place to live when no other space belonged to you. The word moving kept showing up in those early pages. It fascinated me the way it could mean progress for some and loss for others. Sophie was always the one moving forward. New dance classes, new trophies, new friends. I was the one who stayed behind, packing the boxes, labeling the lids, making sure nothing got lost in the shuffle. Even as a child, I understood that moving wasn't just about changing rooms or addresses. It was about being chosen to begin again while someone else stayed behind to clean up. Looking back, I think that birthday was the first time I understood what it meant to be unseen. But it was also the day I began to build something invisible of my own. That cheap notebook, with its flimsy cover and crooked pages, became my secret world, a place where I didn't have to compete for space. Each word I wrote was a tiny rebellion, proof that even if no one else remembered my name, I did. And someday, I promised myself, the world would too. The first time I truly understood what it meant to stand alone was during the county science fair in 7th grade. I had spent weeks in the garage after school, hunched over a table covered in wires and scrap metal, building a small wind turbine from parts I scavenged at the local junkyard. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. I remember the soft whir of the blades catching even the faintest breeze, the hum of energy that felt like possibility itself. Every evening I'd run into the house, excited to show anyone what I'd built. But Mom was usually on the phone organizing costumes for Sophie's dance troupe, and Dad would murmur, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from his laptop. So I learned not to expect applause. The day of the fair arrived on a rare sunny Saturday in early March. The gym at Jefferson Middle School was buzzing with chatter and the metallic scent of fresh paint. Posters lined the walls, each more colorful than the next volcanoes erupting, solar systems spinning, the occasional nervous parent whispering advice to their child. I stood by my project, hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the little silver blades. I kept glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see my parents walk in, maybe holding the camera Dad always brought to Sophie's recitals. The event had started only an hour earlier. I told myself they'd probably come later, after her rehearsal. When the judges made their rounds, I spoke clearly and carefully, explaining how the turbine could generate enough energy to power a small lamp. They smiled, asked a few questions, and moved on. By the time they announced the winners, the afternoon sun was already slanting through the high windows, turning the polished floor into long streaks of gold. I wasn't even listening when they said my name. First place, Nadia Mitchell. There was a brief cheer from the audience, then scattered applause. I froze for a second, unsure they'd said it right. When I walked up to the stage, I turned toward the row of folding chairs where families sat with their cameras ready. The seats marked Mitchell family were empty. I smiled anyway, because that's what you do when you win and no one's there to see it. The principal handed me a small trophy shaped like a light bulb, its base engraved with my name. The flash of a stranger's camera went off, a parent from another school, documenting the winners. The light was so bright it almost hurt. Somewhere in that moment, I realized that being visible didn't always mean being seen. After the ceremony, I lingered near the entrance, clutching the trophy against my chest as the crowd thinned. Sophie's best friend, Lily, waved goodbye to me on her way out with her parents. "Congratulations," she called. I nodded, pretending the lump in my throat was pride. I kept waiting for Mom's car to appear, for Dad's familiar honk from the parking lot. It never came. By the time I walked home, the sun had dipped below the hills, painting the sky a dull orange. I found Mom in the living room, pinning sequins onto Sophie's new costume while Sophie twirled in front of the mirror. The whole room sparkled with the reflection of gold thread. "How was the fair?" Mom asked without looking up. Her voice was light, distracted. "I won," I said. "That's wonderful, sweetie," she replied automatically, adjusting a hemline. Then she added, "I'm so sorry we couldn't make it." Sophie had her dance fitting, and you know how hard those appointments are to get. Sophie grinned at me from across the room. "You should have seen the fabric, Nadia. It's imported from Italy." What?" I forced a smile. "That's great." Dad looked up briefly from his recliner, eyes flicking toward the trophy in my hands. "First place, huh? Good for you." He gave a small nod and went back to reading the newspaper. That was it. No hug. No photo. Not even a space on the shelf for the trophy. Dinner that night was quiet. The air smelled faintly of glue and roasted chicken. Sophie chattered about her upcoming recital, and Mom kept reminding her to practice her turns. When there was finally a pause long enough for me to speak, I said softly, "They took a picture of me at the fair." Mom smiled, distracted. "That's nice, honey. Maybe we can frame it later." She didn't ask to see it. Afterward, I washed the dishes while Sophie practiced in the hallway. Her music echoed through the walls, bright, confident, certain of being heard. I dried my hands, went to my room, and placed the little trophy on my desk beside the notebook from my 10th birthday. It looked too small under the yellow light, like an object out of place. I opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote the first line that came to mind. If silence had a sound, it would echo like this. The graphite left a faint shine on the paper. I stared at the sentence for a long time, tracing each letter with my fingertip. It didn't feel bitter, it felt like truth. The kind you don't say out loud, because no one would know what to do with it. When I turned off the lamp, the room fell into a soft darkness. From down the hall, I could still hear Sophie's laughter and Mom's voice counting beats, the muffled rhythm of a life happening elsewhere. I lay in bed and imagined the wind turning the blades of my little turbine, spinning faithfully in an empty gym somewhere, generating light no one would ever notice. A few weeks after the science fair, Grandma Lillian came to visit. She was the kind of woman whose presence filled a room without ever raising her voice, a quiet force, wrapped in soft wool sweaters and the scent of cinnamon tea. She'd always been more of an observer than a talker, and that afternoon, she watched me from the porch swing as I tinkered with a half-broken radio. The spring air smelled of cut grass and rain, and I could feel her gaze before she spoke. "You're always fixing things, aren't you?" she said, her voice calm but knowing. I nodded, wiping a smudge of oil from my fingers. "They don't stay fixed for long," I admitted. "Maybe not," she said, "but that doesn't make it any less brave to try." When she left the next morning, she handed me a small wrapped parcel tied with an old ribbon. "This was mine when I was about your age," she said. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, the cover soft and worn at the corners, faintly smelling of cedar and ink. She brushed her fingers across the gold-edged pages. "I used to write in it whenever I forgot who I was. It helped me remember." Her eyes softened, and I saw in them something that made my chest tighten, a kind of recognition. As if she understood without needing to ask. "Keep it safe," she said. "And when the world gets too loud, write until it sounds like you again." That notebook became my anchor. At night, I'd sit by the small desk near my window, the lamplight falling over the pages, and write about things I couldn't say aloud, the sound of my parents' laughter drifting from Sophie's room, the way Dad always forgot which subject I loved, the way Mom only seemed proud of things she could photograph. Writing was the only place I didn't have to shrink myself to fit. Every page was a rebellion made of sentences. By the time I reached high school, I had grown used to being the girl in the background. I did well in classes, volunteered at the library, and helped Sophie study for her exams when she panicked. She was the performer, the one everyone expected to succeed, while I was the planner, the one who made sure nothing fell apart. My teachers liked me, but not in the way they adored her. I never made a scene, never demanded attention. Until the day Mr. Reeves noticed me. He was my sophomore English teacher, a man with kind eyes and a coffee mug permanently stained around the rim. One afternoon, he handed back our essays on the topic, The Price of Silence in Modern Society. I'd written mine the night before, pouring every bit of myself into it without realizing it. When he placed the paper on my desk, I saw a single sentence scrawled in red ink at the top. "See me after class." I stayed behind while everyone else shuffled out, heart hammering. He leaned against his desk, holding my essay in one hand. "This," he said, waving the pages slightly, "isn't just an assignment. It's a voice." I opened my mouth, unsure how to respond, but he continued. "You write like someone who's seen things she's not supposed to talk about. That's not bad, Nadia, it's brave." I stared at him, speechless. No one had ever described my words that way before. He flipped to the last page, tapping his pen against a paragraph. "You think small because they make you feel small," he said gently. "But you don't belong in the corner of the room. You belong where people can hear you." I felt something catch in my throat, like a door quietly unlocking. "You ever think about applying to a top university?" he asked. "Stanford, maybe. Or Harvard. Somewhere that lets you stretch." I laughed nervously. "Stanford? That's impossible. We don't even know anyone who's gone there." He smiled, unfazed. "Every student I've ever seen reach something big started by thinking it was impossible. I'll write you a recommendation if you ever decide to try." That night, I wrote about the conversation in Grandma's notebook. The words flowed like water. He said I belong where people can hear me. I don't know what that means yet. Maybe someday I will. I kept reading that line over and over, as if repetition could make me believe it. When I told my parents about Mr. Reeves's suggestion, Mom laughed lightly. "Stanford? That's all the way in California, honey. We can't afford that kind of dream." Dad added without looking up from his phone, "It's good to be realistic. Maybe look at local colleges first. Sophie might want to use the car next year, and we'll need to plan around that." Sophie, curled on the couch, smirked. "California's for movie stars, Nadia, not math nerds." "Aw." I pretended to shrug it off, but later that night, I sat at my desk, the Stanford website glowing on my laptop screen. The campus photos looked unreal, sunlight spilling through palm trees, red-tiled roofs against blue sky, students walking under stone arches with notebooks in hand. It felt like a different universe, one where people like me might finally be seen. I opened Grandma's notebook and pressed my pen to the page. Maybe impossible just means something no one else in this house has tried yet. The ink bled a little, dark and steady. Over the following months, I worked harder than I ever had. I stayed after school, joined the debate team, entered essay competitions, anything that let my voice exist outside the walls of our living room. Mr. Reeves kept his promise. "I'll be your first letter of recommendation," he said one afternoon, handing me an envelope with his signature already scrawled across the flap. I didn't know then that this single act would change everything. When Grandma visited again that summer, I showed her the envelope and told her about my dream. She smiled, proud and wistful all at once. "Stanford," she said softly, as if tasting the word. "You'll like it there. Lots of room for big thoughts." Then she reached out, touching my cheek. "They won't understand right away, Nadia. People rarely do when you outgrow their version of you. But don't let that stop you. Write your story, even if you have to write it alone. That night, I fell asleep with her notebook open beside me, the faint smell of cedar in the air, and for the first time in my life, I felt something new blooming quietly inside me, not rebellion, not even hope. It was resolve. The first time I saw Palm Drive, the sun was setting behind the row of palm trees that stretched endlessly toward the heart of Stanford. Everything glowed gold and red, the color of a dream that had finally taken shape. I stood there for a moment with my suitcase beside me, the warm wind carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and new beginnings. In the distance, Hoover Tower rose like a watchful guardian, its bell echoing softly through the campus. My hands were shaking. Months of essays, interviews, and late-night applications had somehow led me here. When I stepped through the arched gate, I whispered under my breath, "You made it." Not loud enough for anyone to hear, just enough for the version of me who once hid behind Sophie's spotlight to know she'd survived. Move-in day was chaos. Families posed for photos under the Stanford arch, parents cried into each other's shoulders, and students hugged like they already knew they'd remember this moment forever. I stood a little apart from it all, clutching the worn leather notebook Grandma Lillian had given me. My parents hadn't come, of course. The night before, Mom had said she'd try to drive down after Sophie's dance showcase, but I knew she wouldn't. "You're independent," she'd said, like it was praise. It sounded more like a reason not to show up. My roommate, Leah Patel, arrived late that afternoon dragging 3 mismatched suitcases and a guitar case. She burst into the room with her hair tied up in a messy bun and music spilling from her earbuds. "Hi, I'm Leah. Oh my God, we have the good view." She pointed to the window overlooking the main quad, then turned to me. "You're Nadia, right? I read your name on the door. Pretty handwriting. You seem calm, please tell me you're calm." "I need a calm roommate." I laughed, startled by how easy she was to like. Leah had this way of filling silence without crowding it. By dinner, we'd already shared half our life stories and a bag of instant ramen cooked in the communal kitchen. It tasted like salt and exhaustion, but I don't think I'd ever felt more content. The weeks that followed were a blur of discovery. The morning smelled of coffee and ambition. Students rushed between Green Library, Memorial Church, and the engineering quad, their faces bright with purpose. I fell into rhythm quickly: lectures in the day, part-time shifts at the library in the evenings, problem sets that stretched past midnight. Sometimes I'd walk across the oval just to breathe, the stars above sharp and clear like the promises I'd made to myself. I had a life now, one that no one back home could imagine. But the pride I felt was always shadowed by something quieter, a loneliness that crept in when the campus went still. There were moments when the glow of achievement didn't reach me, when everyone seemed to belong to some invisible circle I wasn't part of. On weekends, Leah's parents called to check in. I could hear her laughing through the thin dorm walls. I'd put in my earbuds and pretend to listen to music while reading through data science textbooks, each formula another way to build order out of the chaos of being unseen. At the library, I shelved books until my hands ached, my ID card hanging from a frayed red lanyard. I liked the silence there, the smell of paper and dust, the way sound softened against the high ceilings. It reminded me of the quiet that used to hurt, only now it felt different. This silence was mine. Sometimes, after closing hours, I'd sit by the big window overlooking the courtyard, open Grandma's notebook, and write. I built a life no one cared to see, but it's still mine. Leah and I grew close over the months. She was studying sociology and had a laugh that could shake the whole room. On nights when exhaustion hit me hard, she'd toss me a cup of instant coffee and say, "Come on, Mitchell. No one gets to change the world on an empty stomach." She told me about her family, loud, loving, full of arguments and affection, and I told her about Oregon, about Sophie, about how I used to write because it was the only place I could exist. She listened without pity, which made me trust her even more. One night, she said, "You know what I like about you, Nadia? You build things. Not just machines or code, you build ways to survive." There were other people who noticed me too, professors who saw potential, classmates who admired my precision, but I never quite let my guard down. Success felt fragile, like something that could vanish if I looked away too long. Every A, every late-night breakthrough was a quiet act of defiance, proof that I could matter without anyone's permission. Still, sometimes, I'd catch sight of parents visiting campus carrying care packages, taking photos under the arches, and feel that familiar ache. When Leah's mom sent me a small box of cookies after hearing I'd aced an exam, I almost cried. I thanked her, of course, but what I really wanted to say was, I didn't know love could be that simple. Winter came softly that first year, the trees along Palm Drive turning pale gold before the rain set in. One evening, walking back from class under my umbrella, I passed Memorial Church just as the choir was rehearsing. Their voices floated through the open doors, warm and resonant. I stopped, watching the light spill out across the wet stone. For a second, I wished my family could see this, not to impress them, but to prove that I was here, living a life that was both beautiful and hard. Then I realized it didn't matter if they ever did. The proof was in me, in the fact that I kept showing up, even when no one else did. By the end of that first year, my world had grown bigger than I ever thought possible. Yet, late at night, when the campus lights dimmed and everyone else was asleep, I'd still whisper the same thing I did on that first day at the gate. You made it. Sometimes I said it like a victory. Other times, like a prayer. It was during my second year that I met Professor Gabriel Alvarez, the man who would unknowingly change the direction of my life. I'd enrolled in his course, Ethics and Algorithms, mostly out of curiosity. The room was always full: engineers, sociologists, even medical students, all drawn by his way of making data sound like poetry. He had a quiet intensity, the kind that made people lean forward when he spoke. One afternoon, after class, he stopped me as I was packing my bag. You wrote in your paper, he said, flipping through the pages, technology should never decide who gets to be seen. What did you mean by that? I froze for a moment, unsure if it was a trick question. I began cautiously. That code is written by people, and people carry bias. If we don't check it, we end up amplifying invisibility instead of fixing it. He smiled then, slow and approving. That's a better answer than most graduate students give. I'm starting a small research project this quarter, AI for medical equity. We're studying how to use data to distribute medical supplies fairly in rural clinics across California. Interested? I said yes before I even understood what I was signing up for. That week, I joined a small, mismatched group of students, 2 engineers, a med student, and me huddled in a lab that smelled faintly of solder and burnt coffee. Professor Alvarez told us the goal was simple but urgent. During wildfires and droughts, medical supplies often got stuck in the same bottleneck: too much in wealthy areas, not enough where people were dying. We're building an algorithm, he said, that listens to the people who never get heard. The phrase hit me like a pulse. For the first time, coding didn't feel mechanical, it felt human. The early days were messy. We spent nights staring at spreadsheets, arguing over models, drinking lukewarm coffee from vending machines. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was the one who stayed the latest. Slowly, Professor Alvarez began to rely on me for the details others overlooked. You see the edges, he told me once. That's where fairness hides. As the semester rolled on, I found myself leading small tasks, then meetings, then eventually the entire coordination between the engineering and medical sides. It wasn't about ambition, it was survival, the same instinct that had kept me moving my whole life. I'd learned how to hold things together when no one else noticed the cracks. Now, that skill finally mattered. Leah would joke about it constantly. You bend, but you don't break, she said one night as we sat on the dorm floor surrounded by half-eaten pizza and open laptops. You're like a human rubber band. Do you ever rest? I smiled. Rest is expensive. She looked at me, eyes softening. One day, you'll learn that it's okay to be proud out loud. Maybe she was right, But at that time, pride still felt like a luxury, something I hadn't earned permission for. Our project gained attention faster than any of us expected. A local health nonprofit heard about it and offered to pilot the algorithm in 2 rural clinics. The first time I saw our program actually allocate resources, insulin, antibiotics, masks to the places that needed them most, something inside me shifted. It wasn't like winning a competition or acing an exam. It was quieter, deeper. I'd helped make something that saw people. When the results came in, Professor Alvarez called me into his office. His walls were lined with books and old photographs, hospitals, protests, faces of people whose stories had become statistics. He gestured for me to sit. "You remind me of someone," he said. "A student I once had who thought she had to earn her right to exist in every room. She burned herself out proving she belonged." He paused, his gaze steady. "Don't do that, Nadia. You already belong." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. But that night, walking back along Palm Drive, I thought about his words for a long time. Belonging wasn't something I'd ever felt was given to me, it was something I built, piece by piece, like a machine that only worked if I never stopped turning the gears. The next year, I became president of the Women in Tech organization. The irony wasn't lost on me. The girl who once hid in the library now leading workshops on confidence and leadership. I stood in front of rooms full of women who looked like me, who spoke softly, who apologized before speaking, and I told them, "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to keep showing up." Every time I said it, I felt like I was speaking to my younger self. Leah came to nearly every event, cheering louder than anyone else. "Look at you," she said one evening, her grin wide as we walked back to the dorm. "You're helping girls find their voices while pretending you haven't found yours." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm still figuring out what it sounds like." "Whatever it is," she said, bumping my shoulder, "it's worth turning the volume up." The project with Professor Alvarez grew beyond campus. News outlets picked it up, calling it the Fair Supply Initiative. Donations poured in. We expanded our pilot to clinics in Arizona and Nevada. I spent my weekends traveling with the team, teaching local volunteers how to use the system. Sometimes, I'd see mothers standing in long lines outside those small clinics, clutching prescriptions they could finally fill. Their gratitude was quiet, but it filled a space in me that had been empty for years. It was during one of those trips, sitting in the back of a dusty van full of laptops, that I realized something. Success wasn't about escaping invisibility, it was about helping others be seen. For so long, I'd been trying to prove I was enough. Now, I just wanted to make sure someone else didn't have to. When I got back to campus that spring, I walked through the Oval at sunset, the light washing everything in gold. Students hurried past, laughing, alive in their own stories. For the first time, I didn't feel separate from them. I didn't feel small. I sat under a tree, opened Grandma's leather notebook, and wrote. They never saw me, and maybe they never will. But now, I see others. Maybe that's the real kind of victory. I closed the notebook, letting the pages catch the warm breeze. For years, I'd measured my worth in recognition, in the empty chairs left behind. But here, surrounded by strangers whose lives had quietly changed because of something I helped build, I finally understood. It wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing. It happened on a Tuesday night in late April, when the campus was wrapped in that restless quiet that only comes before graduation season. I was sitting in the study lounge at Green Library, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-finished drafts of my research paper. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound left, and the glow from my laptop cast long, tired shadows across the table. I was about to pack up when a new notification popped up at the corner of the screen. Subject: Congratulations, Nadia Mitchell, you've been selected for the Stanford President's Award. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. My first instinct was to check the sender, half expecting a scam or an automated error. But it wasn't. The message came from the Office of the President, Stanford University, stamped with the Crimson Seal. I reread it 3 times, my heart thudding so loud it drowned out everything else. For extraordinary academic achievement and lasting contributions to community equity, it said, "You have been chosen as this year's recipient of the President's Award." My hand went to my mouth. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounds like disbelief and exhaustion colliding. Then I cried. Not loudly, just quietly, the way I'd learned to feel everything in silence. I scrolled to the bottom of the email and saw the line that made me stop breathing for a moment. "You will be honored at the annual ceremony in Memorial Auditorium. Please prepare a short acceptance speech, 5 minutes or less." I stared at those words until they blurred. Memorial Auditorium. The same hall where, years ago, I'd once stood as an usher for another award, clapping for names that weren't mine. This time, it would be different. Leah burst into the lounge minutes later after seeing my text. I got it. She came running in pajama pants, hair a mess, eyes wide. "You got the President's Award?" she shouted, too loud for midnight. I nodded, still dazed. "Oh my God, Nadia," she squealed, hugging me so hard I almost dropped my laptop. "Do you realize what this means? That's like the Nobel Prize of Stanford students." I smiled through tears. I didn't think they'd even notice me. "But," Leah shook her head, "you've been helping the world notice itself. Of course they noticed you." That night, long after she went back to the dorm, I walked alone to Memorial Auditorium. The campus was empty, the fountains murmuring softly in the distance. I stood at the foot of the wide stone steps, the same ones generations of students had climbed before me, and whispered into the cool air. "From empty seats to open doors." The words came out before I even realized I was saying them, maybe a title, maybe a prayer. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The auditorium smelled faintly of wood polish and history. The rows of red velvet seats stretched out like a sea of expectation, and the stage lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. I walked slowly down the aisle, heart pounding, and climbed the steps to the stage. There, under the single spotlight, I imagined the moment my name would echo through the hall. Recipient of the Stanford President's Award, Nadia Mitchell. My voice trembled as I practiced aloud, though no one was there to hear. "Good evening," I whispered to the emptiness. When they didn't see us, we learned to see each other. The words settled into the silence like they belonged there. I kept going, speaking to invisible faces, to every version of me that had once been overlooked. I stand here not because I was chosen first, but because I refuse to stop showing up last. Because success isn't about being seen, it's about creating sight for others. The sound of my voice filled the space, soft but steady. For a moment, I imagined Grandma Lillian sitting somewhere in the front row, hands folded, eyes shining. I could almost hear her say it the same way she always did when life surprised me. "Some doors open quietly, but they still open." Bye. When I left the auditorium, the night air was cool and tender. I sat on the steps for a long time, watching the soft wind ripple through the palm trees lining the quad. The sky was deep indigo, the kind of stillness that makes you believe the world is listening. My phone buzzed, then a text from Grandma. "Couldn't sleep. Something tells me you got good news tonight." I smiled, typing back, "You always know. I'll call you in the morning." Her reply came instantly. "Some doors open quietly, but they still open. Walk through, my girl." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I stayed by the window of my dorm room, watching dawn bleed across the horizon, turning the world pink and gold. The email was still open on my laptop, the words, "Congratulations, Nadia Mitchell," glowing softly in the dark. It didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something I hadn't quite named yet. For years, I'd measured my worth by who didn't show up, by the empty chairs that marked my milestones. But as the morning light spilled across my desk, I realized something simple and profound. The world had opened its door, yes, but it wasn't the world that made me walk through. I had been opening it, inch by inch, all along. 2 weeks before the ceremony, when the jacaranda trees around campus began to bloom purple, my phone buzzed with a message that should have hurt but didn't. I was sitting under the arch near the main quad, laptop open, finalizing my slides for the ceremony. The afternoon light shimmered against the sandstone walls, warm and calm. Then the screen lit up. "Mom, we're too busy helping your sister move this weekend. We'll celebrate later, honey. Love you." I read it twice, maybe 3 times, waiting for the old sting to rise, the familiar ache that used to hollow me out. But it didn't. I just stared at the message, watching the tiny bubble of text pulse on the screen. Helping your sister move. That was the reason, this time. The words looked ordinary enough, polite even. But I could see the pattern behind them, the quiet repetition of absence disguised as busyness. Sophie's move had become their event, their center of gravity, the orbit that always pulled them away from me. For a moment, I thought of replying with something long, something honest. "It's okay. You've missed every version of this moment before, so why stop now?" But the thought passed quickly. I typed 2 words instead. "That's okay." Then I put the phone face down on the bench beside me, watching a pair of students biking past with their graduation gowns fluttering behind them like wings. There was no anger this time, no trembling hands or silent tears, just stillness, the kind that comes when you've outgrown the need to be understood. I smiled faintly, not because it didn't matter, but because I finally knew it no longer defined me. That evening, after my last rehearsal at Memorial Auditorium, I walked over to the registration tent where they were confirming family guests for the award ceremony. The coordinator looked up from her clipboard. "Hi, name?" "Nadia Mitchell," I said, sliding my ID across the table. She flipped through the list and smiled. "Congratulations. You're on the President's Award roster. You can register up to 3 guests for family seating." I paused for a moment, pen hovering over the form. 3. I repeated softly, thinking about it. Then, one by one, I filled the lines. Seat 1, Lillian Moore, family guest. Seat 2, Leah Patel, friend. Seat 3, blank line. The woman glanced at me. "Would you like me to leave the 3rd name empty?" I nodded. "Yes. But could you mark it with something?" "Of course," she said, curious. "Any note?" I took a breath. "Please label it, reserved, for who shows up." She tilted her head, half smiling, but didn't ask questions. "Got it." The next day, I went to a small florist shop off University Avenue, the kind of place that smelled like rain and memory. The florist, a gentle older man with ink-stained fingers, asked what the flowers were for. I told him it was for a seat that would stay empty. He blinked, thoughtful. "Then you'll want something that stands proud but soft," he said. "Something that doesn't wilt under lights." I watched as he gathered the bouquet, white tulips, for sincerity, and red dahlias, for dignity and strength. He tied them together with a cardinal red ribbon, the same shade as Stanford's crest. When he handed them to me, the bouquet felt light but deliberate, like a message written in color. "Who are they for?" he asked quietly. "For anyone who finally decides to show up," I said. That night, I brought the flowers back to my dorm and placed them on the windowsill beside Grandma's leather notebook. Leah walked in and froze mid-step. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the bouquet. "Yeah," I said, turning the stems slightly so the ribbon caught the lamplight. "They're for the ceremony. I registered 3 seats." "Your parents?" I smiled faintly. "No. Grandma, you. And one that'll stay open." Leah frowned, walking closer. "You mean, like, symbolically?" "Exactly. It's not a reminder of who didn't come. It's for who did and for whoever might, someday." She nodded slowly, understanding blooming across her face. "That's actually beautiful. Grandma used to tell me," I said softly. "Some doors open quietly, but they still open. I guess I'm leaving one open too." We stood there for a moment, the campus lights flickering beyond the window, the tulips glowing white against the night. It struck me then how peaceful everything felt, no resentment, no longing, just gratitude. When I texted Grandma later to confirm her flight, she replied within minutes. Wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm bringing my blue coat and my heart. Then, another message followed right after. Keep a seat open, sweetheart. Not everyone arrives on time, but sometimes they do arrive. I didn't know if she meant my parents or life itself. Maybe both. The next morning, I wrote in her notebook. Some chairs stay empty to remind us that love, when it comes, should always have a place to sit. Then I closed the cover, tied the cardinal ribbon around it, and set it beside the bouquet. The flowers were for them, but the peace, finally, was mine. The morning of the ceremony rose clear and golden, the kind of California morning that seemed made for memory. The bells of Memorial Church began to ring across the quad, their sound rolling through the crisp air like a promise. Rows of students in scarlet robes lined the path toward Memorial Auditorium, their laughter echoing beneath the sandstone arches. Photographers darted between families. The orchestra tuned inside, the hum of strings building into the familiar opening of pomp and circumstance. I stood just beyond the main doors, my hands clasped tightly around Grandma Lillian's old leather notebook. My palms were damp, though the morning was cool. I could hear the muffled sound of the crowd gathering, the rustle of programs, the occasional cheer as another family found their seats. I'd walked past this building 1,000 times, but never had its stained glass windows looked so alive. Light spilled through them now, splintering into shards of crimson and gold that danced across the marble floor. Leah was the first to spot me backstage. She rushed over, clutching her camera. You ready? She whispered, eyes shining. As I'll ever be, I said, forcing a small laugh. Your grandma's already seated, she said. Front row. She looks like she's been waiting for this moment her whole life. I smiled. She kind of has. Oh. When the announcer's voice boomed through the hall, welcome to the Stanford President's Award Ceremony, a hush rippled across the auditorium. I peeked through the curtain for just a second, long enough to see the 3 seats I'd reserved. Grandma Lillian, in her pale blue coat, her silver hair catching the light. Leah, sitting beside her with the camera in her lap, mouthing something that looked like, "You got this," and between them, the 3rd seat empty, crowned with the white tulips and red dahlias tied in that cardinal ribbon. The air conditioning made the petals tremble faintly, as if they were breathing. As the orchestra began its stately march, the doors opened and the crowd rose. The sound of pomp and circumstance filled the hall, majestic, slow, inevitable. I walked with the other honorees down the aisle, the weight of the gown brushing my heels, the stage lights glowing like a sunrise ahead of me. When I reached my seat on stage, I looked up and there it was again, that empty chair. Not a wound this time, but a landmark. Names were read, awards presented, applause swelling and fading. And then, at last, I heard my own. The 2024 Stanford President's Award for Outstanding Leadership and Public Impact, Miss Nadia Mitchell. The applause broke like a wave. I rose slowly, legs trembling, and walked to the podium. The stage lights hit me full in the face, warm, blinding, merciful. For a moment, the noise faded, replaced by the rush of blood in my ears. I thought of Grandma's words. Some doors open quietly, but they still open. I took a breath, adjusted the microphone, and began. Good morning, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. If you look closely today, you might notice something small somewhere in this sea of proud faces. There's an empty chair. A ripple moved through the audience, people shifting, glancing. I used to think empty chairs meant failure, I continued softly. That no one cared enough to fill them. But over the years, I've learned that sometimes they mean something else entirely. Sometimes they mean you showed up for yourself. I paused. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was listening. I grew up in a small town where being quiet was easier than being seen. Where you learn early that love can be conditional, and applause selective. I used to believe success was when the people who ignored you finally noticed. but life has a way of teaching you otherwise. My eyes drifted toward the first rows. Grandma sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her cane, her eyes glistening. Leah lifted her camera slowly. Between them, the bouquet seemed to shimmer in the light. "When no one saves you a seat," I said, "build one. And then add more chairs for those still standing." A faint murmur of approval rolled through the hall. I pressed on. I didn't come to Stanford to be chosen. I came here because I was tired of waiting to be chosen. I learned that success isn't about being picked, it's about picking. Choosing to keep going. Choosing to see others when no one saw you. Choosing kindness when silence might be easier. I could feel the lump forming in my throat, but I kept my voice even. This award isn't about me. It's about everyone who ever sat in an audience full of strangers and wished just once that someone they loved was watching. It's for the student who works 3 jobs to afford textbooks, for the janitor who keeps the lights on long after we've gone home, for the mothers and fathers who couldn't be here but would have been, if life had been kinder. My hands trembled slightly, the paper in my grip fluttering like wings. "I want to tell you something I learned while working on the Fair Supply project," I continued. "In every dataset, there's noise, and sometimes, in that noise, there are stories we overlook, people who go unseen. Our job isn't to erase that noise, it's to listen closer until it becomes music." The audience was silent now, the kind of silence that feels full. So, if you ever find yourself staring at an empty chair, don't let it break you. Let it remind you that you were strong enough to arrive without applause. Let it remind you that your worth doesn't depend on who claps when you stand up, it depends on who you choose to lift when you do. "I'll piss." I looked straight at the camera then, the one streaming live on the auditorium screen. The red recording light blinked like a heartbeat. "To my grandmother, who taught me that silence can be strength, thank you. To my friend Leah, who saw me when I didn't see myself, thank you. And to whoever that empty chair belongs to, thank you too. Because every absence has taught me presence." My voice softened. "I don't know who you're waiting for today, but I hope you save them a seat anyway. Because one day, someone will show up and maybe it'll even be you." I closed the notebook gently and stepped back from the microphone. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, just light, just air, just the faint rustle of programs in the crowd. Then applause began. Small at first, polite, then swelling, spreading like fire through the hall. People rose one by one, until the entire auditorium was standing. The sound rolled over me in waves, cheers, clapping, whistles. I blinked through the blur, and my eyes found Grandma again. She was standing too, tears streaking down her cheeks, her hand pressed to her heart. Beside her, Leah had dropped the camera, wiping her eyes. The empty chair between them glowed softly under the spotlight, the tulips trembling in the faint current of air from the vents. That was the image the cameras caught. The shot that would travel everywhere. A young woman at the podium, the bouquet in the frame, the grandmother crying beside it. The caption would later read, "When no one saves you a seat, build your own." The orchestra began again, the notes of pomp and circumstance swelling once more, but this time, it sounded different, less like tradition, more like triumph. Light poured through the glass above the stage, turning everything gold. I looked once more at that empty seat, then smiled. Not the kind of smile you give to a camera, but the one you give to yourself when the world finally makes sense. In that moment, I didn't feel abandoned or overlooked. I felt anchored, held by the applause, the light, and every invisible thread that had brought me here. I thought of the 10-year-old girl with the wrong name written on her napkin, of the teenager at the science fair, of the student working nights in the library. They had all made it to this stage together. I whispered, under the noise and the music. "We made it." And somewhere in the front row, Grandma lifted her head toward the light and smiled back, as if she'd heard me. That night, after the ceremony, campus buzzed with a different kind of electricity. The clip had already started spreading before I'd even stepped off the stage. By midnight, it was everywhere, retweeted, reposted, stitched into montages of speeches and captions. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. each notification blurring into the next. I didn't open any of them at first. I just sat on the steps of Memorial Auditorium, still in my gown, watching the wind stir the petals of the tulips on that now famous empty chair. By dawn, the hashtags had begun to form: number open doors, number empty seat speech, number Nadia Mitchell Stanford. Someone had clipped the moment I said, "When no one saves you a seat, build one and then add more chairs for those still standing," and paired it with a slow-motion shot of the flowers trembling in the light. It hit 1 million views in less than 12 hours. When I finally opened my phone, the screen exploded with messages. Former classmates, professors, strangers, hundreds of people telling me they cried watching it, that they saw themselves in it. For a moment, I felt weightless, like all the quiet years had finally found their echo. And then, just as suddenly, the names I least expected appeared on the screen. Mom, why didn't you tell us? Everyone's asking why we weren't there. Dad, you embarrassed us on national television. Sophie, you made us look heartless. Do you know what people are saying about us? I stared at the messages for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. There was a time I would have written long explanations, soft words to make them understand. But this time, the silence felt stronger. I turned off the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. The applause from the night before still echoed somewhere inside me, a reminder that I didn't owe anyone justification for being seen. By mid-morning, reporters had started calling. The university shared the full recording, and the local news labeled it the speech that broke the internet's heart. I walked across campus, people smiling, congratulating me. A few even said, "Your grandma's the real icon." I laughed. They were right. That evening, I found myself dialing her number. The phone rang once. "I was wondering when you'd call," Grandma said, her voice warm and knowing. "They're furious," I whispered, watching the last streaks of sunset fade beyond my dorm window. "Mom, Dad, Sophie, they say I humiliated them." Grandma chuckled softly, not unkindly. "You didn't embarrass them, dear," she said. "You revealed them." I let the words sink in, my throat tightening. She continued, her tone steady. "You see, truth has a way of shining its own light. Some people mistake that light for accusation because they've lived too long in shadows. But you didn't speak to hurt them, Nadia. You spoke to heal yourself and those like you. That's something they can't yet understand." I swallowed hard. "Do you think they'll ever see it that way?" "Maybe," she said. "But love doesn't wait for perfect timing. It simply shows up. The question is, will they?" The line went quiet for a moment, the soft static between us like an exhale. "Do I call them back?" I asked finally. Grandma thought for a beat, then said, "No, sweetheart, you invite them forward." "What do you mean?" "Don't defend yourself, don't chase their approval. Just give them the chance to arrive. That's all love ever asks for, a seat at the table." I smiled faintly, tears welling. "Then that's what I'll do." That night, I sat at my small kitchen table overlooking the campus lights and drafted one last message, not defensive, not apologetic, just plain and clear. To Mom, Dad, and Sophie. I know the last few days have been hard to watch. Maybe it looked like I was speaking against you. But I wasn't. I was speaking for the parts of me that learned to grow without you, and for everyone who's ever felt the same. I'm having dinner here tomorrow at 7. 4 seats, no excuses. Come if you want to talk, not as a family to defend, but as people willing to listen. Then I pressed send and turned off the phone. For the first time in years, I didn't pace the room afterward. I didn't replay the message in my head or worry about their reaction. I just sat in the quiet, the kind that no longer hurt, and let the night settle around me. Down on the quad, students were still celebrating, their laughter carrying faintly through the open window. The world outside had changed, faster than I could process, but inside, something even more important had shifted. Grandma's words echoed again, soft as a heartbeat. Love doesn't wait for perfect timing. It simply shows up. Tomorrow night, I would set 4 places at the table, 1 for her, 1 for Leah, and 2 for the people who had spent their lives teaching me the meaning of absence. Whether they came or not didn't matter. The invitation was enough. And maybe that, finally, was the truest form of love, leaving the door open, even for those who once closed it on you. Rain had begun to fall over Stanford by the time evening arrived, soft, hesitant, like the sky wasn't sure whether to cry or simply breathe. The window of my small apartment overlooked the oval, its grass glistening beneath the streetlights. The world outside felt washed clean, hushed, the kind of night that asked for reflection rather than words. Inside, the air was warm and slow. I lit the copper candle holders I'd bought at the campus flea market, set the table for 4, and ladled tomato soup into ceramic bowls that still smelled faintly of clay. The scent of sourdough bread filled the room, crisp and comforting. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing, not because I expected an apology, but because I wanted the space to feel like peace. Every detail mattered: the rocket salad tossed in olive oil, the soft music playing from the kitchen speaker, the extra chair pulled out just slightly, as though waiting. On its back hung a small wooden sign I'd carved the night before, "For who shows up." At exactly 7, a knock sounded. Not loud, careful, almost uncertain. I wiped my hands, steadied my breath, and opened the door. My parents stood there, framed by the yellow light of the hallway. Mom clutched her umbrella like a shield, her hair damp and streaked with silver. Dad's tie was crooked, his expression tight. Sophie stood slightly behind them, her eyes flicking everywhere but at me. "Hi," I said quietly. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom murmured. Her voice trembled just enough to make it real. "We weren't sure if you meant it." I meant it," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." They hesitated, wiping their shoes on the mat as if afraid to dirty something sacred. The smell of rain followed them in. For a moment, none of us knew what to do with our hands, our faces, or the years between us. "This is lovely," Mom finally said, glancing at the candles. "You always had good taste." "Thanks," I said. "Soup's still warm. Sit anywhere you'd like." We settled around the small oak table. The soup steamed gently, filling the silence. The only sound was the faint hum of rain against the window pane. After a few careful spoonfuls, Dad cleared his throat. "You've done well, Nadia. We saw the video." "I figured," I said. "It was powerful." Mom added quickly, as if she could smooth over decades with sincerity. "Everyone in town's been talking about it." "I didn't write it for them," I said softly. "It wasn't about anyone's reputation." They both went quiet. Sophie stared into her soup, her fingers tightening around the spoon. Finally, I spoke again. "Every time I looked for you," I said, my voice calm but steady, the chair stayed empty. Mom's hand twitched toward her napkin. "Nadia." "No," I said gently. "Let me finish." I spent a long time trying to understand why. I used to think it meant I wasn't worth showing up for, but now I see it wasn't about me. Dad exhaled, leaning back. His eyes were wet though he blinked hard. "I thought strength meant you didn't need us," he said. "You always seemed self-sufficient." I didn't realize that was the cost of being unseen. Mom's voice broke next, fragile as porcelain. "I thought showing up for Sophie was showing up for both of you. I thought love was something we could divide evenly, like time." Sophie looked up then, eyes glossy. "I envied you," she whispered. "How you could stand alone, how people respected you for it. I didn't know standing alone meant standing in silence." No one moved for a long time. The rain tapped gently on the glass, rhythmic and forgiving. I reached for my spoon again, took a slow sip, and nodded. "I'm not ready to forgive," I said finally, setting it down. "But I'm ready to practice showing up, starting with tonight." Mom's shoulders loosened, relief and sorrow tangled in her breath. "That's fair. I'm giving a talk next week at the community center," I continued, "about mentorship and opportunity for girls in tech. It's open to the public." Dad straightened slightly. You want us to come? I smiled faintly. Come early if you want a seat. Sophie blinked. Should we come early to get seats? I nodded, this time with a real smile. Early is good. For the first time that night, laughter cracked through the quiet, soft, uncertain, but real. It felt like the first drop of sunlight after a storm. The rest of the evening unfolded gently. Conversation found its way between the gaps, weaving through years of missed birthdays and awkward silences. We didn't talk about blame anymore. We talked about memories, about Grandma's garden, about the dog we'd lost, and the small things that had survived us. At one point, Mom glanced at the extra chair with the wooden sign and whispered, "That's beautiful." "It's a reminder," I said. "Of us?" she asked. "Of what love should look like," I replied. "An open seat, not a closed door." Later, when they left, the rain had stopped. The streetlights glimmered off wet pavement. Dad hugged me first stiffly, as if afraid I might pull away. I didn't. Then Mom's arms found mine, warm and trembling. "We'll come early," she said again, almost like a promise. After they were gone, I stood by the window for a while, watching their silhouettes disappear down the quiet street. The apartment was still glowing with candlelight, soup bowls empty, breadcrumbs scattered across the table. Leah texted a simple "How did it go?" And I replied with a photo, the empty chair, the little sign hanging from its back. Grandma called just before midnight. "Well?" she asked. "They came," I said, smiling into the dark. "And they stayed. I knew they would." "Chairs have a funny way of calling people home," she said. When the call ended, I turned off the lights, leaving only the candles burning. The wooden sign swayed gently in the breeze from the cracked window. I traced the carved words with my fingertips. "For who shows up?" Outside, the rain began again, soft, forgiving, endless. Some people will never come. Some will. But the chair stays as a promise that love is built, not begged. We spend our lives waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right people to fill the space beside us. But sometimes, the miracle isn't in who finally sits down, it's in the fact that we kept the chair ready anyway. And what sign would hang above your chair? The screen fades, the candlelight flickers once, then steadies a small, unwavering glow in the quiet room.